All right, we are on, Barb.
Okay. Hang on a second. There we are. well, welcome everybody to the 14th annual Lincoln Lecture Series at the Museum of the Grand Prairie. Unfortunately, when we set up this lecture series, it seemed like we probably shouldn't do it in person, and so this will be our second annual virtual Lincoln Lecture Series. The Museum of the Grand Prairie, of course, is a facility of the Champaign County Forest Preserve District, and we're very grateful for their support and for all the work that they allow us to do. Tonight, we have a great speaker, but I'd like to talk just briefly, as I always do, put in a plug for the next two Lincoln Lectures. And of course, you can go to our Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter pages to see all of our upcoming programs. But we have two more Lincoln Lectures. One of them is kind of special. We'll ask you to watch a film first. And so, Pat, would you like to tell us about that one?
Sure. So the next event in the Lincoln Lecture Series, as Barb mentioned, is going to be an interesting film discussion on Thursday, October 28th at 7 o'clock Central Time. We'll host a film discussion and Q&A discussing the film titled Lincoln and Douglas, Touring Illinois in Turbulent Times. And we invite you all to join us for that film discussion. Prior to the film discussion, it will be screened on a couple local public access channels, Urbana Public Television, as well as Parkland College Television. And then we'll also provide a streaming option for you to watch as you please with a link on our website as well as our Facebook page. The film itself is the film examines the debates examines the Lincoln Douglas debates, memory of them, and how they're commemorated across the state of Illinois. The film was produced last year in 2020 during quite a tumultuous summer with the pandemic and multiple other things happening around the country, around the world. And it was produced by Dr. Graham Peck, co-director and Wepner Distinguished Professor of Lincoln Studies at the University of Illinois Springfield, alongside Nathan Peck, no relation there, co-director and associate professor of art and design at St. Xavier University, and then also features Sunshine Clements, film contributor and co-founder / co-director of the Springfield, Illinois chapter of Black Lives Matter. And those three will join us for a lively Q&A discussion again on Thursday, October 28th at 7 o'clock Central Time, again, live on our Facebook and YouTube pages, just like tonight. So I'll turn it back over to you, Barb.
And so then on the Thursday, November 18th, so several weeks from now, we will be hosting at 7 o'clock a lecture by Professor Matthew Norman from the University of Cincinnati Blue Ash, who will give a talk called Knowing Him by Heart, African Americans on Abraham Lincoln. Norman will discuss the complex diversity of African American thoughts and feelings on Abraham Lincoln from the 1860s to the 1960s. And we encourage you to join us virtually for that one too. Just tune into Facebook or YouTube and you'll be there. Now I'd like to introduce today's speaker. Richard Striner is a writer and historian whose books and articles have covered political and presidential history, literature, economics, film, architecture, historic preservation. And he just was telling me about a book that he's working on
Eisenhower.
That's right. I was thinking about the one on the afterlife. So it's really, really quite a diverse number of things that Richard has written about. And he taught for over 30 years at Washington College in Chestertown, Maryland. And he is the author of several books about Abraham Lincoln and other books, of course. One called Father Abraham, Lincoln's Relentless Struggle to End Slavery. Lincoln's Way, How 6 Great Presidents Created American Power. and the book that he will be speaking about tonight, Summoned to, and it just came out during the pandemic, in June of 2020, I believe.
Correct.
It's called Summoned to Glory, The Audacious Life of Abraham Lincoln. And I know that you all didn't tune in tonight to listen to me talk, so I will let Richard tell us about the audacious life of Abraham Lincoln. Thank you very much for being here, Mr. Striner. We really appreciate it.
Barb, thank you for that lovely introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you virtually. Someday, I hope I can come out and actually visit the Museum of the Grand Prairie. I've never seen it, but someday I would very much like to. Yes, I'm going to be talking tonight about Lincoln, about the book-length study of his life, the biography that I wrote that came out last year, Summoned to Glory. And I'm going to tell you right away that, like plenty of historians, I had a strong point of view, an agenda, if you will. As the subtitle of the book makes clear, I believe that Lincoln led an audacious life. I'm going to try to back up that assertion in the minutes to come. But in arguing this, I am challenging a powerful and long-standing tradition that views Lincoln as a moderate Unionist. You know the way scholars are. They have a penchant for classifying things. If you do a search in the political science literature, I'm willing to bet the term, the classification moderate Unionist will come up again and again. And I think it's wrong. And I believe I can prove it. But it's a powerful stereotype, so powerful that 20 years ago, one historian who wrote a Lincoln biography asserted that if any one quality typified Lincoln's personality, behavior, and leadership, it was an essential passivity, a, quote, reluctance to take the initiative and make bold plans, unquote. How do you like that? That's not the way I see it at all. I think that's dead wrong. 30 years before that, another Lincoln biographer asserted that Lincoln's mind and body moved slowly, which tends to be the way with country people, quote unquote. How's that for a generalization? As it applies to Lincoln, it's just wrong, but I can understand why a lot of people came to that conclusion. I've been discussing the moderate part, the Unionist part of the label that is so frequently attached to him. Very easy to understand. He is, of course, has been and still is known by many as the great emancipator, but more on that momentarily. If you go to the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., he's not presented that way. He is presented as the savior of the Union. You can all visualize the beautiful statue of Lincoln enthroned by Daniel Chester French. And on the marble wall behind the statue are chiseled these lovely verses. In this temple, as in the hearts of the people, for whom he saved the Union, the memory of Abraham Lincoln is enshrined forever. Well, he saved the Union, all right, but he saved it his way. And the Union would not have been at risk at all if it had not been for the position that Lincoln took on slavery. These are strong claims, I know. I will take up the challenge of presenting evidence to support this point of view. Not the least of the dimensions of this problem is the tendency among many different kinds of people to challenge Lincoln's reputation as the great emancipator. I mean, there have been many Lincoln detractors down the year who sought to detract from his reputation for different sorts of reasons. I mean, some of them Confederate sympathizers, some of them civil rights activists, and among the latter, in latter-day years, one often hears the point made that others did more to end slavery. The radical abolitionists deserve more of the credit. African Americans, both free and enslaved, deserve more of the credit. And I'm willing to deserve that many people deserve credit for the extinction of slavery in the United States, but I believe that without the kind of mind and the kind of leadership that Lincoln possessed, the outcome could have been precisely the reverse. The anti-slavery movement in the 1850s and 60s could have been set back a half a century or more. Things could have gone terribly wrong, and almost did. Almost did. But in addition to the grassroots advocacy, slavery had been denounced for give or take 2 generations before Lincoln took up the challenge. That grassroots advocacy was essential. There had to be choruses of denunciation, protest from people who were willing to take a step back from an institution that all too many other Americans took for granted and radically and frontally challenge it. That was a necessary precondition. But the abolitionists by themselves could not deliver the force that was needed. And force was needed. It took a person with a mind capable of visualizing and orchestrating power that finally took the form of military force. Without that, the denunciations could have gone on, and slavery would have simply become more and more entrenched. Now, one of the reasons why it's difficult to make these arguments, at least difficult to make them in a quick, convincing fashion, is that there is good reason. There has been good reason for people to come to the conclusion that Lincoln was just a moderate unionist, because essentially he said so himself. Many of you have heard, will remember, have perhaps memorized the sentences that I'm about to quote in a letter to the editor that he wrote in August 1862 to the political journalist and editor of the New York Tribune, Horace Greeley, in which Lincoln famously stated that his paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. And he went on to say, if I could save the Union without freeing any slaves, I would do it. If I could save the Union by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. If I could save the Union by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. Unquote. Well, there you are. He said it himself. And surely Honest Abe meant it. I'm going to assert that he did not. I'm going to assert that he was being deceptive. I can prove it. But I'm going to take a step back for a moment from Lincoln and his times to talk about the slavery issue more generally. And I'll try to expedite this and make it quick. Some of you may know a lot of it already. But the Founding Fathers were deeply divided on the issue of slavery. Some of the founders, particularly those delegates to the Constitutional Convention from South Carolina, were ardent defenders of slavery. And some of the compromises in the Constitution were necessary to appease the defenders of slavery. But the most famous of the founders, even the ones who owned slaves themselves, were more than willing to admit, no, they proclaimed that slavery was wrong. The slavery was fundamentally at odds with the nation's ideals founding ideals as expressed in the Declaration of Independence, and that for the nation to be true to itself, slavery would have to go. Problem was, it was a powerfully entrenched institution. There was a huge amount of capital invested in it. There was a huge amount of white supremacy sentiment, and alongside that, fears of possible race war if the shackles were broken. And so most of the anti-slavery founders agreed that a gradual process would have to be launched for the purpose of getting rid of slavery over time. The first part of the process was containment. You couldn't get rid of it if it continued to spread. And so in the 1780s, several pieces of legislation passed by the Confederation Congress, operating under the Articles of Confederation, limited the spread of slavery. The Northwest Ordinance, for example, passed by the Confederation Congress in 1787, as the federal Constitution was being drafted, prohibited slavery from existing in the western lands above the Ohio River that were being groomed for future statehood. The grand vision was to contain it and then put the institution of slavery on course for long-term extinction, phase it out. And one of the most potent ideas for doing this was to pay off the slaveholders. You eliminate the economic issue, just buy the slaves and then set them free. In 1819, James Madison calculated that it would cost about $60 million to do that in terms of 1819 values. This was a secret exercise that he conducted, but others were advocating it openly. Now, there was a general consensus. Some, dissented heatedly, but there was a general consensus that slavery was on course for phase out and that this was a good thing until the Missouri crisis of 1819, 1820. Congress had made no provision for the institution of slavery either existing or not existing in the Louisiana Purchase territory. The French had permitted it. It already existed in and around St. Louis and New Orleans. The state of Louisiana proper was admitted as a slave state in 1812. As many of you know, when the areas around St. Louis organized themselves to petition for admission as the slave state of Missouri in 1819, a firestorm broke out in Washington, and there were threats of secession if the institution of slavery were not permitted to spread. And I'm sure many of you know the famous outcome, the Missouri Compromise, orchestrated chiefly by Henry Clay, the trade-off being that Missouri was admitted as a slave state, and it was balanced out, you see, by a newly created free state, Maine. At that time, there were an equal number of free states and slave states, so the balance was maintained, even Steven. That's what people are taught about it in high school, if they are taught about it in high school anymore. But what is usually not taught is that there was more to the Missouri Compromise than this. In order to prevent this divisive issue from coming up in the future with regard to the lands within the Louisiana Purchase, Congress established a dividing line across the Louisiana Purchase. South of that line, new slave states would be allowed. North of that line, slavery would be banned. Well, the votes in Congress shook out sufficiently along anti-slavery lines that the slave interests got only a tiny amount of territory. The border was drawn westward from the southern border of the new state of Missouri. And at that latitude, the Louisiana Purchase territory is fairly narrow compared to its lateral extent up at the Canadian border. The short of it is that really only one more slave state would be allowed, Arkansas, and that everything else in the Louisiana Purchase territory would be off limits for slavery. And at that point, a number of pro-slavery leaders Most particularly and notoriously John C. Calhoun, took a look at that map. They took a look at the handwriting on the wall. So far as the power arithmetic was concerned, it was obvious that unless other plans could be made, other forces unleashed, over time, all those lands to the north of the dividing line would come in as free states. And at that point, the slave states would be outnumbered. And at that point, being outnumbered, the leaders of the slave states could do nothing to stop anti-slavery legislation in Congress, except to claim that the legislation was unconstitutional. But if the new majority of free states should reach the supermajority level of 3/4, there would be enough free states to ratify an amendment to the Constitution and make the protest of unconstitutionality moot. And that is how slavery was finally ended, through the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, right? Calhoun foresaw that. And foreseeing it, he proposed a number of ways to forestall such an outcome. He had a best case strategy and a worst case strategy. His worst case strategy was secession. Put the slave states and the institution of slavery within them out of reach of the federal Constitution by just proclaiming a fundamental right of state sovereignty sufficient to launch that state, any slave state, into secession if the fight about slavery should be lost from their point of view. That was the worst case strategy. The best case strategy was to find ways to expand the geographical scope of the United States to bring in more lands that could be groomed for admission as slave states. And first opportunity to do that was when Texas province split away from Mexico. The issue of Texas annexation, kept the area in limbo for 9 years because of the issue of slavery. Now, I do need to accelerate this presentation, and I will. The controversy, the power showdown over the spread of slavery by the 1850s, after the Compromise of 1850 supposedly settled the issue once and for all, and of course it did not. The controversy was between anti-slavery activists in both of the existing parties, the Whig Party and the Democratic Party, who for various reasons opposed the spread of slavery. Didn't mean they liked black people, didn't mean they cared much about slavery where it already existed. Importantly and interestingly, some of these free soilers, there was a free soil movement active in both of the existing parties, were white racists. Now, why did they care anything about the spread of slavery? Why did they oppose it? Well, one reason is simple enough. They were white racists, and if they and their families planned on going westward, they didn't want blacks going westward because they didn't like them. But there was another reason, a whole set of other reasons. But one of the ones that focused the minds of these people most urgently was the fact that in 1847, the white workers at a foundry, the Tredegar Iron Works in Richmond, went on strike for better hours and wages. The owner fired them all and brought in slaves to run the factory, and the experiment was quite successful. Now get this, he didn't purchase the slaves, he rented them. He rented them. And by the end of the 1850s, the vision was slavery spreading to the north as an industrially based form of labor that could threaten the jobs of white workers. Slave strike breakers brought in, and shackled in freight cars. The issue became, the issue was already the most divisive political controversy in the United States by 1850. In 1850, Calhoun, who had not very much longer to live, was agitating for slave state secession if the new state of California should be admitted as a free state. It was, but there were other elements thrown into the Compromise of 1850 to appease slaveholders, not least of all a draconian new fugitive slave law. Well, Calhoun hadn't long to live. There were people who said this compromise, again engineered by Henry Clay, who also hadn't long to live, had settled the issue permanently. Lincoln believed, or at least hoped, it had settled the issue permanently. And then in 1854, Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois pushed through legislation to overturn the Missouri Compromise, the compromise of a generation earlier in 1820. The Kansas-Nebraska Act allowed any area within the parts of the Louisiana Territory that was still unorganized, not yet carved up into states, allow any territory, sub-territory within the Louisiana Purchase to be admitted as a slave state if a majority of the white settlers voted it that way. Douglas called that his doctrine of popular sovereignty. Congress passed it. President Franklin Pierce enthusiastically signed it, and all hell broke loose because the free soil movement in both of the existing parties, the Whig and Democratic parties, was absolutely electrified. So many free soil Democrats were infuriated that they were ready to form a new party, to break away, form a fusion party. And free soil Whigs, who were like-minded, were ready to do the same. And that was how the Republican Party was founded, in the 2 years between 1854 and 1856. A new party, the Whig Party, shriveled up and died by 1856. The Democratic Party survived, but it had been purged. Well, the anti-slavery wing of the Democratic Party had gone into voluntary exile, and those Democrats who stayed Democrats represented the hardcore of racist pro-slavery sentiment within the Democratic Party. There were white racists in the Republican Party who didn't want slavery to spread for the reasons I've explained. But for those abolitionists, those militant opponents of slavery who were willing to take political action, there was a radical abolition party, the Liberty Party, that had been founded as early as 1840, and it still existed on the eve of the Civil War. But for those anti-slavery activists who were inclined to think strategically, the Republican Party looked awfully promising as a way to at least maybe achieve what the Founding Fathers had tried and failed to achieve, namely the containment of slavery. How are you going to phase it out and get rid of it if it keeps spreading? And it was the Kansas-Nebraska Act that radicalized Lincoln and essentially gave him his life's work. That was the way it came together for him. He'd served one term in Congress, then he was back practicing law in Springfield, and he was at loose ends in the early 1850s. And then in 1854, when he became enraged, along with other free soilers, he decided he would make it his job to go in hot pursuit after Stephen Douglas, punish him, throw him out of the Senate and take his place, and reverse the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And that is how the Lincoln-Douglas antagonism started. That's how it played out in election year 1858, the year of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, the year in which Lincoln, in his House Divided speech, broke with his long-term, now long-deceased political idol Henry Clay, the great pacificator, the architect of these union-saving compromises, Henry Clay. Lincoln's position by 1858 was there will be no more compromises. There must be no more compromises, and there must be no more slave states. That was the message of his House Divided speech. It's interesting how many people who have not read the House Divided speech, presuming that Lincoln was, of course, a moderate unionist, they think they know what he must have said in the speech. The gist of it, they think, was that the Union was becoming divided, and this tragic tendency must be reversed. The precious Union must not be allowed to divide. That's not what Lincoln said. He said the reverse. He said, the Union is already divided and it is being unified. The house divided is being brought together, and that must be stopped because it's being brought together the wrong way. This is an all or nothing struggle between slavery and freedom. And at this point, he said, ladies and gentlemen, the Union, the house divided, is being united the wrong way because slavery is about to spread north and become a national institution. And we must stop that. We must stop it. We must redivide the house to see that it gets brought back together the right way. But first, we've got to have this power shakeout. Now, why was Lincoln afraid that slavery could spread into the free states, whose free state constitutions forbade it? Well, the Dred Scott decision of the year before, 1857, laid the groundwork, Lincoln warned, for the toppling of all the free state constitutions as unconstitutional per the terms of the federal constitution, which is supreme law of the land. You see, the way the Supreme Court under Chief Justice Roger Taney was construing the federal constitution, they were reading it as a pro-slavery document. Taney laid down the principle that the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, grab bag amendment that contains a number of different things, including the right to take the fifth, right to protect yourself against self-incrimination. But one of the key clauses of the Fifth Amendment states that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And Roger Taney said, well, slaves are property. And if Congress passes a law telling the owners of this property that if they cross a certain line into federal Western lands, they do not have the use of this property anymore. They're being deprived of it. It's being, in essence, taken from them without due process of law. A preposterous argument, Free Soilers argued, but that was the way the Supreme Court ruled. And the preliminary issue was the toppling of the Missouri Compromise, the holding of the Kansas-Nebraska Act to be perfectly right and proper. The message to the Free Soil movement being, fold your tent and go home. Your program, your political purpose is dead on arrival in Washington. You want Congress to pass a law forbidding the spread of slavery. Well, Congress doesn't have the power to do it because of the Fifth Amendment. Well, people were understandably focused on the territorial portion of this decision. But Lincoln saw there was a far more insidious aspect to the Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott was a Missouri slave, not a field hand, but a house servant. The history of the case is a long one, and I need to speed up in any case, but he sued for his freedom based upon the fact that his owner took him out of the home state of Missouri to places where slavery was forbidden, to the northern part of the Louisiana Purchase before the Missouri Compromise was toppled, and to the free state of Illinois, and then brought him back home. And Dred Scott argued, and his lawyers argued for him, that as soon as he set foot on free soil, he should have ceased to be a slave. He should have become free. And the Dred Scott decision said, no, he shouldn't. He was a slave under Missouri law, and his status must be governed by the laws of the home state of his master. And so Lincoln, in the House Divided speech, said, look, if one slave owner can bring one slave to one free state, this state, and keep him here enslaved for a long time, 3 years, Why can't thousands of slave owners bring thousands of slaves into any free state or so-called free state and keep them there as slaves a long time? The Dred Scott decision opens the door to that. And we have got to topple the Dred Scott decision. We have got to take on this insidious movement that seeks to denature the American creed as expressed in the Declaration of Independence. And Lincoln used the Declaration of Independence over and over in the Lincoln-Douglas debates to this effect. I'm going to quote you a brief extract of a speech from 1858 that is not at all well known, as the House Divided speech is. It's an electrifying speech. It was delivered at night by torchlight. It was a rally in Chicago. Lincoln spoke from a balcony of the Tremont House Hotel to a crowd of supporters and some detractors down below. Thousands of them. I mean, imagine the scene. The text, I mean, we would all love, I'm sure, to, if only film technology existed at the time and we could see and hear Lincoln in action as we can see and hear FDR and so on. We have only still photographs and printed words on a page. I happen to think that Lincoln delivered this speech quickly because it was an extemporaneous speech. It wasn't composed in advance and carefully crafted. It was delivered off the cuff. And newspaper reporters took it down in shorthand. That's how we have a transcript of it. I think he delivered it fast because if you read it aloud slowly, it just doesn't come over very well. Whereas if you read it quickly, as I'm going to read it, it's a very charismatic performance. It's wordy. It doesn't have the finely crafted grace of the lines that Lincoln wrote out and revised for his best speeches, but it's powerful. And it uses the Declaration of Independence like the silver cross in front of a vampire. Stephen Douglas. There's one other thing that I have to, just a moment, let me just look at the excerpt. I'm sorry, I don't need to clarify the point that I was going to because I'm reading a short excerpt. Bear with me, indulge me. Listen to this rendition of this fiery Lincoln speech at the Torchlight Rally on July 10th, 1858. I should like to know if taking this old Declaration of Independence, which declares all men are equal upon principle and making exceptions to it, where will it stop? If one man says it does not mean a Negro, why not another say it does not mean some other man? If that declaration is not the truth, let us get the statute book in which we find it and tear it out. Who's so bold to do it? Voices, me, no. And if it is not true, let us tear it out. Voices, no, no. If I had read a longer excerpt from the speech, you would feel the rolling power, the incantation-like power of this speech. You won't find those words chiseled on the walls of the Lincoln Memorial, you know, the memorial to the savior of the Union. This was all about slavery. It was Lincoln's challenge to Douglas in 1858 that lifted him to national stature, laid the groundwork for his nomination for the presidency by the Republican Party in 1860. And it was his election that triggered the secession movement because the Republican Party platform was a free soil platform and Lincoln would not back down. Slavery would not be allowed to spread, period. No more compromises, which meant no more slave states. And as soon as Lincoln was elected, the leaders of the most militant of the slave states, always had been, South Carolina, activated old John C. Calhoun's worst case scenario. They invoked the principle of state sovereignty and declared South Carolina severed from the federal union And the South Carolina Secession Convention, in its message to the citizens of South Carolina, made it absolutely clear that the reason was the threat to slavery. And in the months that followed, the Mississippi Secession Convention made it equally clear there is no question that the issue of slavery caused the Civil War. And it was Lincoln's election itself that triggered the outbreak of secession. If Lincoln had not been staunchly committed to the Free Soil platform, secession wouldn't have happened. So that, well, one more thing. In the months between South Carolina's bid for secession, most of the slave states, the southernmost slave states, the Gulf states or cotton states as they were called, fell in line. In February 1861, a convention was called in Montgomery, Alabama, to draft a constitution for a Confederate States of America that would protect slavery. Lincoln hadn't even been inaugurated yet because presidents in those days were still inaugurated on March 4th. And in the months between Lincoln's election and inauguration, the lame duck Congress tried desperately to isolate South Carolina, to contain the secession movement and squelch it. And Senator John Crittenden from the slave state of Kentucky proposed another compromise on slavery, the Crittenden Compromise, it was called, a package of constitutional amendments that would settle the issue forever. And one of those amendments would permit the continued spread of slavery. In secret, President-elect Lincoln sent messages to Republicans in Congress. It was secret because the letters were marked private and confidential. And the gist of the letters was, kill this. Kill this. Stop it. Hold on, he told one Republican senator as with a chain of steel. He would not back down. Now, I want to go back to that famous statement Lincoln made in the letter to Horace Greeley in 1862, his paramount object being to save the Union. Whatever he did was to save the Union. That was the paramount object. And as to slavery, whatever it took to save the Union, free them all, free none of them, free some, leave others alone, whatever it took to save the Union. If that were true, why did Lincoln sink the Crittenden Compromise? He should have been all for it. Doesn't that make sense? Why? It makes no sense, and his statement to Horace Greeley was pure deception. There would have been no break in the Union to patch up if it hadn't been for Lincoln's election on the platform of free soil. It caused the Civil War. Lincoln said what he did in August 1862 because midterm elections were coming up, and he had already drafted the Emancipation Proclamation, and he figured there would probably be a huge white supremacist backlash against that. So he kept it under wraps for several months until a military victory, sufficiently lustrous to give him a convincing platform to issue the proclamation as a Union-saving anti-Confederate measure, the Battle of Antietam. But that's why he said it. It was a deception. Save the Union. There were lots of different ways to save the Union. And a lot of Democrats wanted to open negotiations with the South, revise the Constitution, call a new constitutional convention. William Seward, Lincoln's foremost rival for the Republican nomination in 1860 and his Secretary of State designate, was all over the map in Washington, working with would-be seceders, trying to placate them, figuring out new compromises without Lincoln's authorization. There were lots of different ways to save the Union. Lincoln was determined to save the Union his way, with slavery contained and on course for eventual extinction. But let's look at the Civil War as it broke out upon the beginning of Lincoln's presidency in a different way. He was fighting the secessionists not only to save the Union, He was fighting to destroy the new nation that these people were trying to create, the new, powerful, pro-slavery nation. He meant to kill it like you kill a snake in the egg. He would kill it by fighting total war, by fighting a war far more ambitious in its strategic grounding than the precepts that were taught at West Point. As a wartime commander-in-chief, Lincoln was far tougher than most of his generals until close to the end, when he finally found the team, Grant, Sherman, Sheridan, who, were willing to carry out Lincoln's total war conceptions. That is not moderation. It's audacity. Now, there's something else that I want to bring into the conversation that we're going to have. As Lincoln strove to achieve bipartisan consensus on a Union-saving Civil War, as early as the first year of his presidency, he was working secretly behind the scenes to increase the anti-slavery content of that war. In November 1861, in secret, he drafted legislation to be introduced in the state legislature of Delaware, the smallest of the slave states, smallest state slave population. What he was trying to do was to make it appear as if the state legislature of Delaware was asking Congress for financial assistance to get rid of slavery. He wanted it to look like it was a spontaneous thing coming from the state itself. It wasn't. It was something he was orchestrating. It didn't work. Whereupon in March 1862, he decided to try directly out in the open at the federal level to get the process started. What process? Phase 2 of the anti-slavery vision, the phase out part. The containment would be achieved as long as he refused to back down on slavery expanding compromises and defeated the Confederates in battle. But he came to the decision, why not use this as an opportunity to launch the second part of the long-term vision of the Founding Fathers, put it on course for extinction. And so in March 1862, he got Congress to pass on a straight party line vote legislation offering financial assistance to any slave state and the owners of slaves in any slave state, including the border states that had not fallen under the control of secessionists. Uncle Sam would buy their slaves and then free them and send them out of the country. This was the colonization idea, a very controversial proposition among anti-slavery and pro-slavery Americans. We can discuss it in the Q&A session if you like. But it was an attempt by Lincoln to prevent a backlash of white supremacy sentiment as he began to increase the radicalism of the Civil War's aims. He was being extremely crafty, working all the while behind the scenes. In January 1862, two abolitionists paid a call on Lincoln in the White House, William Henry Channing and Moncure Daniel Conway. We know about this because Conway wrote his memoirs a generation or so later, and he described the meeting. He and his colleague as abolitionists said to Lincoln, you should be much more ambitious. You should be using this war as an opportunity to get rid of slavery once and for all. And Lincoln said, in essence, that is exactly what I am going to seek to do, but the timing has got to be right. I do not yet have a sufficient base of support to pull it off. And we've got midterm elections coming up. If the Democrats get control of Congress, you can say goodbye, to any chance of staying the course that the Republicans have set. But here's what I want you to do, Lincoln said. I want you to go home and start calling me names, all right? Don't spare me. He said, go out and get people fired up. that I am obtuse, I am slow, I just don't get it, scream and yell at me to go after the root cause of this war, slavery. Call me names. I want you to. It will help me. It will give me leverage. Now, have you ever heard of any president encouraging his allies to trash his own reputation for the sake of achieving a strategic goal? I haven't. I mean, that is Machiavellian craftiness. Lincoln was extraordinarily deceptive, for the best of reasons. The offer of financial assistance handed down by Congress in March of 1862 went nowhere. Between March and July of 1862, Lincoln invited delegations of political leaders from all the border slave states, that is, the ones that were still not under the control of secessionists, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri. He invited them to the White House and almost pleaded with them to kick off the plan, to give it a try, to show that it could work and that its effects would be absolutely harmless, that it would take away the root cause of the war. His aim was to get a demonstration project started, a pilot project, if you will, that could be applied later to the rebel states once they were conquered. And Lincoln couldn't get a single one of these border state politicians to take him up on the offer. And so in July, no doubt in my mind that he was in an extremely angry state of mind, he decided to do a mid-course correction in the long-term strategic plan, flip the sequence. His idea at first had been to get slavery phased out in the border states and go after the rebel states later. He decided we'll go after the rebel states first, get the other ones later. And we won't pay them anything. This was the basis for the Emancipation Proclamation. I'm willing to bet he was saying to himself, you can't even pay them to do the right thing. You can't even pay them off. Well, so much the worse for them. We'll give them till New Year's Day, 1863. And if they don't lay down their arms and knock it off, my armies will start to free their slaves just as soon as they can get within reach of the slave population. And of course, that's exactly what began to happen. Now, in 1863, as the Emancipation Proclamation began to be carried out, and thousands of slaves began to be freed, especially in Mississippi during Grant's Vicksburg campaign, Lincoln was only a year away from having to face the voters again in 1864. And already there was a very significant white supremacist backlash against emancipation. Jefferson Davis had a 6-year term under the Confederate Constitution. Lincoln would have to face the voters again in 1864. And strategist that he was doing worst case contingency planning. You know, if the war wasn't over, if the military struggle turned into a stalemate with heavy casualties, he might well get thrown out of office and replaced by a white supremacist Democrat who would, of course, abrogate the Emancipation Proclamation and try to send all the freed slaves right back into bondage. And so Lincoln began a very interesting secret experiment. And I think he got the inspiration from the fact that the new breakaway state of West Virginia was admitted as a new free state in June 1863. In that very month, June 1863, Lincoln began working with anti-slavery whites in New Orleans who had opposed secession. They didn't dare say so, but now New Orleans and a great deal of Louisiana was under Union military occupation. So Lincoln worked with a political general, Nathaniel Banks, Republican, who was at that time commanding the occupation of Louisiana, to get a process started in synergy with these Unionist and free soil white citizens of Louisiana to call a constitutional convention and rewrite the state constitution of Louisiana, changing it from a slave state into a free state. And by the end of 1863, you see, it's a hedge strategy. If things are not going well in power terms on the federal level, well, use the power you have to work where you can. At the state level, eradicate slavery one state at a time. By the end of 1863, Lincoln had this state level conversion process underway in Louisiana, Tennessee, Arkansas, and it was moving, but moving slowly. By the end of 1863, Lincoln really felt, the force of time closing in on him. And in a private letter to General Banks, he said, in essence, hurry up, it's taking too long. Now, in this very same month, December 1863, in his annual message to Congress, Lincoln releases his proclamation of amnesty and reconstruction. And here is another major item that the believers in Lincoln, the moderate unionists, trot out to prove his moderation. The so-called 10% plan. I'm sure many of you know the provisions. Proclamation of amnesty. An attempt, Lincoln said, to shorten the war by getting rebels to call it off and stop being rebels. The proclamation said, as soon as anyone in rebellion against the Union shall cease their rebellion, I will pardon them and return any seized property, except slaves freed under the Emancipation Proclamation, but they get pardoned and they get their property back, meaning it's safe to give it up. You're not going to be arrested for treason and stood up before a firing squad. That's the amnesty part. The Reconstruction part went like this. Lincoln said, as soon as 10% of the electorate in any state now in a state of rebellion, 10% of the electorate as of the election of 1860 have taken this oath of allegiance, I will, in addition to pardoning these people, I will recognize them as the electorate to begin the process of home rule in that state. They can elect a legislature, they can elect a governor. As soon as 10% have taken this, and Lincoln was attacked by more militant anti-slavery people, by the radical Republicans. To this day, the 10% plan has gone down, as a very lenient plan for reasons that are perfectly understandable. Here you see the moderate, lenient Lincoln just trying to save the Union, shorten the war, let the South up easy, with malice toward none, charity for all. Nonsense. Because there was another part of the oath these people had to swear, and this usually doesn't get taught. They had to swear not only loyalty to the Union and the federal Constitution, they had to swear, so help them God. And this is in the Bible Belt, so an oath taken upon, the Holy Bible meant something. They had to swear, so help them God, that they supported the Emancipation Proclamation and all the anti-slavery acts of Congress. They had to swear to that too. Now let's take another look at this Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction and see how lenient it looks. A mere 10%? Right. If you couldn't swear that you supported the Emancipation Proclamation, you couldn't vote. See? You couldn't vote. The only people who would be allowed to vote in these reconstructing states would be anti-slavery whites. And it wouldn't take very many of them, only 10%, to overpower the wishes of a 90% pro-slavery majority and turn that slave state into a free state. Now, how does it look? How lenient and moderate does it look? It was a tricky, high-handed act of audacity. It was in many ways the reverse of what it seemed. It was a way to force fast abolition over the will of 90% of the state's voting population. I mean, this was the Lincoln I came to know as I studied his life more and more. He was Machiavellian. And as election year 1864 began, and Lincoln was looking at the serious prospect of being thrown out of office and replaced by a white supremacist Democrat, Lincoln wrote in secret to the new Free State governor of Louisiana, a fellow named Michael Hahn, and said, as you redo your state constitution and become a free state, you might want to consider extending voting rights to some blacks. But this is for your eyes only, not for the general public. Keep it secret for now. Public didn't know that Lincoln was trying to lay the groundwork for phasing in black voting rights. These were the risks that he was taking. And by the end of summer 1864, it looked like he was going to lose it all. Despite all the brilliance of Ulysses S. Grant's leadership in the Virginia theater, the campaign was bogged down. The casualties were appalling. The war weariness and white supremacist backlash were getting worse every day. And Lincoln invited in secret the black abolitionist Frederick Douglass to the White House. Douglass set this forth in his memoirs, this account. Lincoln said, I'm going to be beaten and beaten badly. And what I want you to do is organize a band of black scouts, that's the way Lincoln put it, to infiltrate behind rebel lines and spread the word of emancipation among enslaved populations and urge these people to run away, get out, cross Union lines, and come within the realm of my power so that I can free them while I still have the power. And as we all know, that was not the way things had to turn out, because William Tecumseh Sherman, in the Battle of Atlanta, turned the Union mood around overnight. The political effect of that Union victory, in many ways, it was, in my judgment, the Battle of Atlanta, not Gettysburg, that was the real turning point of the Civil War, because Lincoln was reelected in a landslide. And after that, any of you who saw that Steven Spielberg film Lincoln all those years ago, it focused on this particular interval, the work Lincoln did behind the scenes to force the 13th Amendment, which had stalled in Congress, to force it out of Congress. And the deal making, the wheeling and dealing, the hardball politics, Lincoln was absolutely in his element, and he pulled it off with no visible traces. In January 1865, the 13th Amendment was passed by the necessary two-thirds supermajorities and sent out to the states. It would require, of course, a three-quarters supermajority of states to ratify it. Now, in the spring of 1865, Lincoln began working wholeheartedly with radical Republicans to lay the groundwork for a reconstruction that would be far more radical than a lot of people expected. For one thing, in February 1865, how's this for audacity? He came up with the idea, and he proposed this to his cabinet, of getting Congress to appropriate $400 million to pay the slave states to ratify the 13th Amendment. Did you know that? His cabinet didn't like it much, so he put the idea away, but he might have brought it out, later. Can you imagine thinking of such a thing? Actually paying states to ratify a constitutional amendment. Surely that's unconstitutional, right? Well, the Constitution doesn't prohibit it. So Lincoln decided, well, we're just going to do it. In February 1865, William Tecumseh Sherman, having concluded his march to the sea from Atlanta to Savannah, was preparing to march north, join forces with Grant, deliver the coup de grace to Robert E. Lee and his army. But in his march through Georgia, Sherman had freed thousands and thousands of slaves per the Emancipation Proclamation. They were following his army and slowing it down. And so Sherman called a meeting in Savannah with several black clergymen. The meeting was so important that Lincoln's Secretary of War, William Stanton, sailed down to attend the meeting. Sherman said, what can I do to get these people settled so that my army can move faster? And they said, give them land. And so Sherman issued this special field order, number 15, setting forth a tract, thousands of acres in South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida to be conveyed to these emancipated slaves. Well, in March of 1865, Congress passed and Lincoln signed the bill creating the Freedmen's Bureau, a remarkable precursor to the agencies of the New Deal in the 1930s that would deliver direct federal assistance to individuals bypassing the states. In this case, assistance to emancipated slaves. And among the things that the Freedmen's Bureau was authorized and directed to do was to survey seized and abandoned lands into 40-acre tracts to be conveyed to emancipated slaves on a promissory basis that Congress would have to make final in authoritative legislation later on. But the Freedmen's Bureau was to begin the work of land redistribution, massive land redistribution to former slaves. The Republican Congress passed it. Lincoln signed it. Getting the picture? In Lincoln's last speech, the last speech the poor man was ever destined to give, after Lee had surrendered, an immense crowd gathered at the White House to celebrate, and Lincoln gave them a speech on Reconstruction. And in this speech on Reconstruction, he said several remarkable things. First of all, he talked about the Louisiana experiment. He said, it's very gratifying that this former slave state is now a free state. They have a new free state constitution. Some people complain that blacks are not given the right to vote. I wish they could be given the right to vote. Some of them, anyway, those who served as soldiers in our armies. But the legislature has the power to do it. The state constitution gives them that power. Let's build upon that. I mean, and then he became really charismatic, urging it. And he said something else in this speech that is, to me, quite hilarious. It seems sort of inexplicable unless you dig a little bit deeper. He said, some people have expressed chagrin that my mind has not seemed to be definitely fixed upon the issue of whether the seceded states, so-called, are in the Union or out of it. He said, I have chosen never to address this issue because it is a useless one in practical terms. The secession movement is dead. The Union is together. Let's not worry about whether these states have been in the Union or out of the Union. Well, here you again have the lenient understanding Lincoln, but to claim that he'd never taken a position on it. What on earth could the man be saying? In his first inaugural address, in a 4th of July message to Congress in 1861, he insisted the Union was not broken, could not be broken, was perpetual. There had been no secession. These seceded states, so-called, were in the Union, not out of it. And now he's saying, I never even thought about it much. Well, here's what I think was going on. Certain radical Republicans, Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania, had been working on a theory to the effect that when the slave states in question had come under the control of secessionists who had committed treason, those states had lost their statehood. They had committed state suicide. And they weren't states anymore. They should be treated as mere unorganized territory, and Congress should have the power to reconstruct them from the bottom up and from the top down, slice them, dice them, change them around any which way. Well, Congress was out of session when Lincoln gave this speech. The new Congress would not be convening until December 1865, unless called into special session by the president over the summer. What I think Lincoln was doing by pretending he had never taken a position on this issue of the states being in or out of the Union, I think he was sending a message to the radical Republicans between the lines. To wit, if you want to pursue this state suicide theory of yours, they're not in the Union. All right, I'll do business with you because I frankly don't care much about the constitutional metaphysics. Let's get down to what kind of a society we're going to create in the post-slavery South. That's what was on his mind. And in the summer of 1865, I am convinced he meant to establish a pilot program to demonstrate Black voting rights in Louisiana, his laboratory state to serve as a model for other states. And at the end of the speech, John Wilkes Booth turned to two of his co-conspirators and said, sorry for having to use the N word, but that's the word that Booth used. He said, "This means nigger citizenship. Now, by God, I'll put him through." That's the last speech he'll ever make. How do we know Booth said this? After the assassination, the murderers were pursued. Booth was killed before he could be apprehended and brought to trial, but other conspirators were apprehended, brought to trial, tried, convicted, and executed. In the course of the trial, they had lawyers. They talked to their lawyers. Several of these lawyers wrote memoirs, and that's how we know, through cross-corroboration from more than one account, what Booth said on the day of the last speech Lincoln was ever to give. What Booth did was to destroy a new future that was emerging for the United States, a future in which Lincoln, with a new 4-year term ahead of him, with the Republicans controlling both houses of Congress by supermajorities, I think we could have had the civil rights revolution of the 1960s 100 years earlier in the 1860s if Lincoln had lived. He had the audacity to propel a revolutionary change, and it was never to be. Look, I've talked for a long time, but before I quit, I want to read you reminiscences by two lawyers, friends of Lincoln's, colleagues of his before the Illinois bar. These people were talking about Lincoln, the attorney. This is in the years after his death. They were reminiscing about what Lincoln was like in court. Tricky, deceptive. Listen to this. One fellow attorney observed that Lincoln, quote, had the manner of treating his antagonist with such perfect fairness as to make the jury and bystanders think he could not be induced to take advantage of him. A manner which was the hell-firedest lie that was ever acted, because the very fairness he assumed was an ambuscade to cover up a battery with which to destroy the opposing counsel, and so skillfully laid to, that after it had done its work, only occasionally would the defeated party, and almost never would the uninitiated discover the deception, unquote. Here's another account by a close friend and political ally of Lincoln's, fellow attorney Leonard Swett, describing Lincoln in court. Quote, as he entered trial where most lawyers object, he would say he reckoned it would be fair to let this in or that. And sometimes when his adversary could not quite prove what Lincoln knew to be the truth, he would say he reckoned it would be fair to admit the truth to be so-and-so. When he did object to the court, after he heard his objection answered, he was often say, well, I reckon I must be wrong. But by giving away 6 points and carrying the 7th, he carried the case, the whole case hanging on the 7th. He traded away everything which would give him the least aid in carrying that, but he carried it. Anyone who took Lincoln for a simple-minded man would very soon wake up on his back in a ditch, unquote. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Hope I didn't talk too long. Try your patience, but if you're still with me, I'd be very happy to answer questions and talk with you.
Thank you so much, Richard. That was just fascinating. And I have a list of questions of my own myself, but of course, this is not about me, but about the people who have been just, I'm sure, as riveted as I have been. We did have several questions. One of them, the first one that came in from Peter Farm, is an odd one, and I've always taken this story to be like the Washington chopping down a cherry tree story. So
no, it's a
no, but it's did he purchase a female slave?
No, nothing to it whatsoever.
Okay,
but abolitionists would sometimes purchase slaves for the express purpose of freeing them. In fact, many escaped slaves would then try to raise money to purchase, their
Slaves.
spouses and children. Frederick Douglass, after he escaped, raised money to purchase his own freedom. There's a controversy in Baltimore right now as to whether Johns Hopkins, the philanthropist who founded the university and the hospital, owned slaves. Historian at Johns Hopkins University looked at some census returns from 1850, and the census taker at one of Johns Hopkins estates listed 3 or 4 slaves. And she came to the conclusion that, this philanthropist and doer of good deeds, supposed abolitionist, was in fact a hypocrite and owned slaves. And there's a big controversy right now in Baltimore as to that, because in my opinion, this historian rushed to judgment without, looking at other possibilities. I mean, for instance, there were a lot of free Black laborers in Baltimore. These could have been free Blacks who were working for Johns Hopkins. The census taker could have done a very careless job. He saw some Blacks and just presumed they're slaves, put them down as slaves. We don't know how accurate this census was.
Right.
It could have been free Blacks, or Hopkins could have purchased them to free them, because we know from the documentary record that Johns Hopkins did this. So maybe that's the explanation. Big, tempest right now in Baltimore over that controversy. But as to Lincoln purchasing a slave, no.
There's no evidence.
No.
Right. We did have another question. Was Jenny Woltowitz said she didn't know any of this. Where did you find the sources for this book? Which I suspect I know, but go ahead.
Well, I've been reading about Lincoln for a very long time. And as we historians say, there's primary literature and secondary literature. The secondary literature consisting of books written by historians about the subject. If you're going to look into it properly, you want to, see what other historians have said, what they've claimed, what they've proved, what they've concluded by way of interpretation. But I went through Lincoln's collected works. I looked at the primary documents, the written record that Lincoln left. I looked at the reminiscences of others. You want to spread a very broad net, to bring in as much information as you possibly can. But it was my own intuition. That's too weak a term. I mean, at a very, very low level, I engaged in some power strategizing in a previous life, as they say. Just out of grad school, I founded and led a historic preservation nonprofit organization in the nation's capital, fighting to preserve historic buildings, fighting against, greedy developers and their scurvy allies, crooked politicians, shyster law firms, and so on. And
it was my own heart. But yes, I understand what you're saying.
It was tough work. I mean, we had to, we were just a bunch of idealistic kids in blue jeans, up against formations of tremendous capital, millions and millions of dollars. We had to figure out schemes of power leverage to slow down their machinery and sabotage it. And one of the things we did was get pro bono, i.e. free, assistance from big law firms, so we could hit them with lawsuits and bog down their process in a way that would cost them untold thousands of dollars in legal fees, carrying costs, you name it. When we were sitting pretty, we weren't paying anything, and use that leverage, to force them to the bargaining table. We had to live by our wits that way. And having been through an experience like that, you look at what Lincoln did, and I saw a larger than life version, of the scheming that I had to do. He was an orchestrator of power. I could feel the moves, because I'd been through it.
You've done it yourself.
I'd walk that ground, and a lot of academic historians, they have to cope with faculty politics and departmental politics, and politics within a college or university can be extremely vicious and challenging. But no, I had a real life experience that gave me a different slant on this, so that. I was reading a very negative account of Lincoln by a historian who was several generations ago very famous. Richard Hofstadter was his name, and in 1948 he wrote a book of biographical chapter essays, rather like Plutarch's Lives. It was called The American Political Tradition. One cameo portrait after another of an American leader, and they were almost all scathingly negative. It was a debunking exercise, iconoclastic. These men are not what they claim to be. They should not be put on lofty pedestals. Here was really going on. And in the course of Hofstadter's chapter on Lincoln, he quoted from the account of that meeting with the two abolitionists in January 1862, where Lincoln said, don't spare me. Go out and get people stirred up, call me names. And the significance made me sit bolt upright. My goodness, I said to myself, that's different. And I know exactly what he was up to. I know why he was doing it. Of course, that's why he was doing it. And it went straight past Hofstadter. He didn't see, the significance at all. It's what you look for, but it's also what emerges based upon your own repertoire of experience.
That's I wondered, Pat Kane, our behind the scenes fellow, asked what motivated you to complete this research and write this book, and it sounds like you've already answered that question.
Well, it's a more personal story than that. There's a lot more to it.
Right.
I had never written a book. I'd never written that much of anything outside of classroom essays in my PhD dissertation. And over a span of time, I began to get the idea that I could write books, and that I might be as good at it as I was fighting developers. I just had the sense that it was something I ought to try. And it just seemed to me that Lincoln would be a natural subject, because among his detractors, he was so often underestimated people who have never gone through the hard work of actually changing, the course of events. The extent of their advocacy is to denounce, to protest, which is fine. That is often very, very necessary. But denunciation and protest by itself does not change the power realities of the world. This guy knew how to harness and channel and wield power to create new futures and prevent evil futures from taking shape. That's the way it seemed to me. And I just felt the powerful conviction that this was a message that I had to compose.
Yep. I had several of my own questions, and we're asking for the last round here from the audience. You at least 3 times you used the modifier Machiavellian, who you might want to explain to, because we have a broad range audience. But do you have any notion that Lincoln read Machiavelli?
I don't think he read Machiavelli.
Okay.
But the instincts to wield power in a crafty manner, to orchestrate power, to employ deception where necessary, These are insights that will occur spontaneously to people who possess those sorts of minds. And if you read Machiavelli, that might or might not enhance your own innate instinct. But this is a personality type that is, perennial. Some
Right.
people are awfully good at this,
Right.
if I may say so. I'm pretty good at it. I can recognize the talent in others, and there's some people who don't think in these terms at all. There are other people who do and get squeamish and don't, push things to the full extent that arguably they ought to.
Sure.
Yes, Machiavellian. Uh-huh. Other questions?
That's good. The first question is really a comment. I wondered if you could tell us who the first lawyer that you read at the end of the talk was. You said Leonard Sweat was the second one.
I would have to look at a footnote in my book.
Sorry.
No, it's quite all right.
The reason I ask, and while you're looking, I can tell the others. Leonard Sweat was one of course, the lawyers that Lincoln practiced with on the circuit, and he tried to establish an office in Urbana, which is in our county,
Mm-hmm.
and ended up establishing an office in Bloomington, I believe, which is in the next county to the west of us. And it brings us right to how close Lincoln was to our own soil, right? I mean, he and why we do this lecture series, so we remember, it's part of our DNA too.
Wonderful lecture series to have out there in Illinois.
And I was happy to hear that that you're talking about Leonard Sweat.
All right, I'm going to the chapter that gives an account of Lincoln's early career in the law. I'm sorry, I don't want to burn up.
Don't worry about it. That's fine. It wasn't that important. I just wanted to.
Well, no, I looking back, I probably should have identified that attorney by name in the text instead of in the footnotes. Wait a minute now. Wait a minute. Footnote 23 in chapter 4. Bear with me now. Here we are, chapter 4, 23. I hope I identify him in the footnote. Oh, okay. This is an unattributed manuscript. No authorship recorded. It's an account.
Oh, okay.
Ida Tarbell papers, which are Allegheny College. And another Lincoln scholar and biographer, Michael Burlingame, suggested, this is his opinion, that this particular account was written by an attorney named James C. Robinson.
Okay.
But that's Burlingame's conjecture. We're not sure.
Good. Well, good. Thanks.
Sure.
My last question is kind of philosophical. This narrative of Lincoln being focused on saving the Union. When you were talking about it being etched on the Lincoln Memorial, it occurred to me that is exactly the same time that the early 20s, right? Like the height of the rise of the Ku Klux Klan.
It was definitely the Lincoln Memorial, a production of its times.
Right.
And after the progress of radical Reconstruction, and during a brief interlude in the 1880s, and a lot of people don't know this, blacks continued to vote in a number of ex-Confederate states. The reason, bear with me, but some of you might find this interesting. The reason is because there were serious rifts within the white electorate along class lines. There was a lot of lower class discontent. And by keeping blacks voting, they became kind of a swing factor, you see.
Oh, okay. That makes
Well,
sense.
you know, the people in the power positions could tell the poor whites, you know, vote for me because I'll keep those, you know, so and so's under control, and then they could turn right around and tell the blacks, we're not a bunch of, you know, ignorant rednecks like these people who are making your lives miserable. Uh, uh, we want to treat you right, but you know, you need to help us help you, vote for us, you know, play them both off
Right,
against
right.
each other. And in the 1890s, when the new Populist Party was founded between 1890 and 1892, the Southern populist movement was very, very interesting. It was an attempt to bring about an interracial, class-based coalition of poor people.
Mm,
You know,
wow.
to tell the whites, don't fall for this race stuff. It's just a game of divide and conquer. You're being played off against each other. And the Southern populists were making very significant strides, and the unleashing of this torrent of white supremacist abuse in the 1890s and the disfranchisement of blacks
Mm-hmm.
was, in my judgment, an attempt to thwart Southern populism, break things up, and
Mm-hmm.
rekindle, you know, that white supremacy sentiment among the poor whites. And it worked. It
Mm-hmm.
really worked. It worked far better than the instigators, you know, dared to dream. It was an absolutely hellish time of persecution, lynching, murder.
Yep.
And the narrative, as you say, in the 1890s, when the nation was really riven by class conflict because there was a terrible economic depression, and you know, there were apocalyptic themes of class war in the air. This was the centennial of the French Revolution.
Right. Oh,
uh,
yeah.
and um, a number of people said, look, we've got to pull ourselves together as a nation, get through this. We got through something much worse, the Civil War, and came out stronger for it. Eh?
Mm-hmm.
North and South learned from each other. The white South learned that the Union is precious and that slavery was wrong. If they didn't learn it, they should have learned it. But the North learned a few things, you know, from the South too, like about, you know, the way these blacks really are and the control you've got to maintain. We learn from each other, you know, it's all one big happy family now among whites. And in the early 20th century, it was more and more the norm to emphasize Lincoln as the savior of the Union, not the great emancipator.
Yep.
For those reasons.
Yes, that's and you know, it remains today, unfortunately.
Now, a lot of things are
To a lesser degree, but
a lot of things are changing today in some ways that are rather appalling, but we won't get into that.
yes, let's not. Well, Richard, we've come to the end of the questions. We have a couple of comments that said enjoyed it. Very interesting perspective you bring. Thank you for sharing it with us. And we had, you know, a couple dozen people tonight that really got a whole. I think I got a whole new perspective. I mean,
well, it's been my pleasure. I thank you so much
it
for
really
the
was wonderful.
invitation, and I would very much like to come out and see your museum.
Well, we will be here. We're open 6 days a week right now.
Wonderful.
COVID shut us down for 2 or 3 months last year, but you can't keep us down. So.
Well, I'm vaccinated and going about my business.
Well, so are we.
Good. Good.
We still have to abide by masks indoors, according to the governor, but we're doing almost everything we used to do.
Well, you follow the rules and you know, persevere. Things are going to get better.
Well, Richard, thanks again. I really appreciate it, and we'll talk soon.
Great. Thanks so much again. Good night.
Bye-bye. Good night.